Brazen.
I'm Tom Wright, co-founder of Project Brazen. If you've been listening to our podcast, Dynamite Doug, you know it focuses on the looting of Cambodia's art and how so many priceless statues wound up in Western museums and with rich collectors. For this bonus episode of Dynamite Doug, our reporter Neha Wadekar traveled to Kenya, another place where historical artifacts were lost from the country, traded, or stolen by European colonizers. Now, artists and anthropologists are trying to connect Kenyans with these missing cultural objects. They're using 3D printing and virtual reality video games to teach Kenyans about their heritage. But it's no replacement for the real thing.
Okay, I played Nintendo as a kid. Do I have to do both or just one?
Just one. So the second one.
I'm standing in a dimly lit one-room office on the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya, with Brian Njenga, a digital artist and game developer. He's just handed me a pair of fist-sized black plastic rings with joysticks on them.
So pretty.
Okay. This is your hand.
Okay, where's my hand? No.
Here's
my
your
hand.
Okay, so this is just like a mouse controller. Okay.
Brian is an artist who uses computer software to create 3D images. He specializes in the heritage of historical artifacts. I came to this office to test out a virtual reality game he's created called the Heritage Project.
One of these?
Oh, for real?
Yeah.
I slip the black Oculus headset over my head.
How is it? Is it comfortable?
It's a little loose. Could I tighten it a little
bit? At the top or
bit?
at the back?
A futuristic Kenyan village appears in front of my eyes. It looks like a video game that kids would play, with bright colors and cartoon-like huts. Towering above the whole village is a giant faceless man with flowing dreadlocks. He's a symbol representing anyone responsible for protecting Kenya and her culture. I meet two other characters in the game, which are drawn from traditional myth and legend. One is called Yarimu, which means the stupid one in the language of Kenya's Kikuyu tribe, one of the dozens of ethnic groups in the country. The other figure is a Kikuyu man talking to the spirits of the mountain. Brian explains that as I walk through the village, I can go into the different huts, which are designed to imitate traditional tribal homes. They're decorated with red banners with gold writing that gives information about the ancient artifacts displayed inside. Brian encourages me to pick up any of these objects, a drinking jug or leather tribal belt or wooden ceremonial shield, to take a closer look.
You're a human being, you're used to having two hands.
So I can just... Okay.
But it basically does the same thing. You can grab an object with this as well.
Okay. I walk up to Irimu, the stupid one. He looks like a Plato caveman, and he's sitting inside a dark cave where the legends say he lived. As a kid, Brian's parents told him that Irimu ate disobedient children. That's why Brian depicted him sitting in front of a boiling cauldron, holding a large carved wooden spoon.
Oh my God.
He's holding a spoon. Go try and grab it.
No.
Wait,
I dare you.
I can't grab it. Oh, I have to move my hand?
Yeah, move your hand and actually interact with the object and press this to grab it.
Each artifact in the huts has a digital tag you can view to learn about its origins and uses. I pick up a jug made by the people of the Kamba tribe. It's shaped like an elephant's tusk. Reading the tag, I learned that it's made out of wood and leather, it weighs 22 grams, and it's currently living in a museum in Germany.
You can actually hold the objects and you can just look at them in a 3D kind of way. So it's more immersive than a museum visit.
Brian created this 3D game to connect more Kenyans with their heritage. For some players, it's as close as they can get to these items because so many of Kenya's cultural treasures are on display in museums abroad.
Those objects were not meant for museums in the first place. They were not meant to be kept in any institution called museum, which is a very foreign thing for in Africa.
That's Juma Ondeng, an anthropologist who works at the National Museums of Kenya and an attaché at Kenya's Ministry of Tourism, Wildlife and Heritage.
So when we look at the circumstances under which those objects were taken, a number of them borders on human rights violation. And therefore, bringing them back is part of restorative justice. You are bringing back something that's not supposed to be taken in the first place.
Juma says a lot of Kenya's cultural artifacts were forcibly taken by British colonizers who arrived in the late 1800s. When the British introduced an Anti-Witchcraft Act in 1925, they used it as an excuse to confiscate any traditional items they claimed were related to the occult. Missionaries made Kenyans who were converting to Christianity give up their traditional religious objects too. The British colonial administration also confiscated anything related to the brewing of traditional African alcohol. Juma says these were all just excuses for colonizers to grab Kenya's cultural treasures and keep them for themselves.
Of course, we now know that they never destroyed this item and then much later on transferred these objects to their museums, either as donations or at times they sold them to art dealers who ended up giving them out to museums.
However, Juma says some of the artifacts that left Kenya were traded legitimately.
But we also have other collectors who came to the continent much later on mutual visits between independent African museums and the former colonies, and they also did extensive collection. So not all collections actually are criminal in nature. They were collected in a more civilized way, as I'll put it.
Today, regardless of how they left Kenya, most of these artifacts live in museums in Europe and North America. To better track where they ended up, Juma and others launched the International Inventories Project, or IIP. It's a collaborative effort between Kenyan and European organizations to catalog historic Kenyan objects held in institutions around the world.
President Emmanuel Macron argues it's unacceptable that around 90% of Africa's artistic heritage is outside Africa, and says
Juma and his colleagues were inspired to create the database after French President Emmanuel Macron announced he was willing to repatriate African art that France had acquired in problematic ways.
In 5 years, he wanted to start the process of temporary or definitive restitution.
That was back in 2017. After that, France returned a few dozen objects to African countries. But since then, efforts have largely stalled.
Of course, we all know that several years down the line, nothing has happened. So the whole idea around the database was not just database, but it was also hoped that as we gain more information about how these objects left, there will be a moral obligation from the museums holding them to give them back to the communities where they came from.
As of 2020, the IIP database contained more than 32,000 artifacts. Today, Juma says the project is on pause due to funding constraints. The question of whether to repatriate art and artifacts is controversial. As a result, it can take decades for one country to get its cultural objects back from another, and often repatriation doesn't happen at all. Juma says there are often legislative roadblocks, like a 1960s law that prevents the British Museum from removing any item to sell or give back, even if it wants to.
So assuming you identify your collection, the museum, even through their board of trustees, they do not have power to give it back to you.
There are also financial incentives for countries holding on to cultural objects. Sometimes the items are actually counted as a part of a city's assets, which can be linked to levels of government funding. So if an institution gives objects back and its total asset value goes down, it won't get as much government support. Finally, Juma says, sometimes the countries that are trying to get their objects back aren't putting up enough of a fight.
Most of the African countries have not been pushing enough. During the independence negotiation, African countries were also demanding the return of the looted colonial objects during the colonial period. However, when independence came, these demands were relegated to the background as the fight for other resources became more pronounced.
While the battle to repatriate Kenya's objects continues, some Kenyans are using technology as a stopgap measure. On a cloudless, warm day in March, I drove out to Kasarani, a small town outside Nairobi, and knocked on the door of a one-bedroom apartment turned 3D print shop. I was there to meet Brian Jenga, the 3D artist and VR creator who you heard from in the beginning of this episode. Kenya has dozens of tribes, each with its own unique heritage and culture, and Brian is obsessed with tracking, documenting, and sharing their history. For him, it's personal.
I come from a culture that has mixed backgrounds, both Kikuyu and Luya, and I know none of the languages. Reason being, my parents used the language like a secret kind of communication that the kids weren't supposed to understand. So by the time we grew up, I had a phase where we stopped caring about it. And then we grew up a bit more and realized we actually felt like there was a gap we were missing in our lives, our culture, we didn't have it. And it's not something you can just Google and learn
Brian started doing research and realized that younger generations of Kenyans are losing their connection to their heritage. That's why he founded the Heritage Project, a digital initiative that aims to make historical artifacts, sites, and narratives accessible to Kenyans online. That includes 3D printing replicas of the missing objects, as well as virtual experiences like the one I tried. Brian is careful about how he talks about the objects he's reproducing and how they ended up outside of Kenya in the first place. He doesn't say too much about colonialism and theft.
So the objects themselves, most of them got there through really, how do I say this, controversial ways.
Why are you being so polite? That's my question.
I have to, because at the end of the day, we still need to work with the existing generation who actually are the custodians of the objects. So as much as what we're doing is kind of weird in regards to we are making replicas instead of actually demanding for the objects to come back. But
Brian and his team need to work closely with foreign governments so they will allow them to take close-up photographs of the objects in their collections.
So what happens is we go to the museums, we get 360 images of the objects, and we use artificial intelligence to stitch those images together and to get an...
Those photographs are then turned into 3D models that can be printed out or used in a VR game. And for a less virtual and more tangible experience, Brian is working with Juma Undang and others to actually 3D print replicas of ancient artifacts, like a historic smoking pipe or a wooden ceremonial shield, that look and feel as close to the originals as possible.
It not only gets the 3D model accurate, but also the textures, which is a key factor because it's a historical object. So you get to see the aging of the object, the condition of it, and how it was built, the paint they use, the texture, essentially.
But the governments and the museums holding the objects are the gatekeepers of the artifacts. They hold the power.
So
if you blatantly accuse a government of colonialism and theft, that's not going to help you achieve your goal.
And no, it'll do the opposite. Regardless of the fact whether it's truth or not, it's going to make the process a bit more difficult.
So far, Brian has 3D printed 20 objects and digitized another 25 for his virtual reality experience. But he makes it clear that he doesn't see 3D printing in VR as a replacement for repatriation.
This is in no way a substitute of trying to get the objects back home, in no way. But for the objects to come back home, first step is people need to know what's missing, what exactly is it, and why they should care. And then we can have a bigger group of people with a bigger voice asking for their items back home. Because at the moment, the museums even in a good year, they get about 3 letters from Kenya in general, but they're trying to increase that. So the more people know about them, the more we can communicate it, and the louder the voice we can have as a community to have them back.
And what about the argument that we hear so often that Kenya is not capable of taking care of these objects the way that they should be taken care of, and therefore they should stay in European museums?
It's offensive, to say the least, because first off, it's an excuse, and second of all, it's we made them. We know how to maintain them.
Most Kenyans can't afford to buy the Oculus headset that Brian used to make his VR game. But he's planning to make his virtual museum more accessible by creating a version that can be used on mobile phones. We'll be right back. To see the 3D printing process in action, Brian introduced me to Dennis Poriot, who works with him on the project. He's one of only 10 or so people in Kenya doing 3D printing, and Dennis operates his business out of a one-bedroom apartment, printing everything from statuettes for wedding cakes to plastic machine parts. The 3D printer takes up most of the room.
This one room is your whole operation here.
Yeah.
It's got a large flat plate lying horizontal on a table. It's flanked by 2 vertical metal bars, which suspend a movable nozzle above the plate. As I watch over his shoulder, Dennis explains how the 3D printing process works. He starts programming the proper settings into the computer by inputting a 3D file of a Kenyan tribal belt made from layers of braided brown leather, and transforming it into a language that the printer can understand. As he explains, he points to the screen so I can follow along.
So the 3D printer works by depositing plastic layer by layer. So slicing it up into hundreds, sometimes even thousands of layers.
Once the model is inputted into the software, Dennis can select his settings.
That's the layer height, that's the thickness of the layers for when the printer is printing. So you set that among many other settings depending on the type of material you use.
Once Dennis has input all the settings, he turns on the printer. The machine starts to hum as the printing nozzle deposits a paper-thin layer of plastic, just 0.15 millimeters, in the shape of the belt, and then goes over it again, adding layers as it zooms back and forth. Printing the belt will take around 10 hours. Some items, like the traditional smoking pipe, take up to 40 hours to complete. Once the printing is done, the belt will be a solid gray object. The team then paints on details of the original item to give it authentic coloring. Dennis tries his best to replicate the objects exactly, but he says there's nothing like the real thing.
For example, some of the items, they looked quite the almost exact copy, but once you get up close and feel it, it's not the real object. Yeah.
I wanted to see Kenyan cultural objects in real life, outside of Brian's VR experience and Dennis's workshop. So I drove to Thingira Cultural Village outside of Nairobi.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Jambo.
It's a plot of rural land that has been built to look like an ancient village of the Kikuyu tribe. Leah and Njoroge, the co-founder of the village, greets me as I arrive.
It's beautiful out here.
Very nice and fresh. Yeah. Away from the hustles and bustles of Nairobi.
Clusters of huts dot the landscape, full of replicas and originals of the artifacts the Kikuyu once used. Leah tells me that the village's mission is to preserve Kenyan culture and educate new generations about their heritage.
So we felt that there is a huge gap between the old people and the younger people. And this gap, if it's not bridged, then we might be having a problem in the future. Our culture was perishing very fast. And that's why we came up with this facility.
The land for the cultural village was purchased years ago, but it wasn't ready to receive visitors until 2019. And then COVID hit, decimating tourism across Kenya. The cultural center is still struggling to recover. I'm the only visitor that day, and find many of the exhibits half completed due to lack of funding. Leah's colleague David takes me on a tour.
So, well, if I can show you, this is their hut.
He leads me into a traditional hut where the village's warriors used to sleep.
Oh, look, you can stand up.
Yeah.
You can stand up
Yeah,
inside.
and they didn't have a lot of things, just a bed. And on this side, this is where they used to store their weapons. That is the bows and the arrows, the spears. They were kept here. Even the blowing horn. I can show you the horn. It's an old cow horn. So this one was to alert the others that the invaders have come. So they used to keep some of them.
Leah and David show me a bunch of artifacts, some over 100 years old. They have gourds used to store food and drinks, a mortar and pestle, and a very special wooden shield with rows of triangle-shaped carvings on one side and multicolored symmetrical patterned paintings on the other.
It is Kikuyu Ndome. And the story behind this shield carries the whole crown of the Agikuyu. You see, when it was taken to UK or wherever they are putting it in those museums, it is reading something else. They are saying it's a war shield. It is not a war shield. It has history behind it. It's getting worn out now because it's a little bit old. I think it's maybe 150 years also. This is a shield that was given to each and every male when they get to a certain age. It's a mantle, if I may say, that carries the culture of that clan.
The Ndome shield was one of the objects selected for the 3D printing process. But Leah is skeptical. In her view, Kenya should be focusing more on getting its stolen artifacts back, instead of trying to find ways to print copies.
Same thing. But for us, we don't want copy pasting. We are original people. African, we like to keep it original. We are original. And if, like this one, if it is preserved, it will be much more better to tell our children or our future generation, this is the Ndome. And on the other side, we are saying it's okay to have a parallel Ndome, which is in 3D preserved, maybe somewhere in London. It's okay. They can keep the 3D and we keep the original.
Many other Kenyans familiar with the project agree with Leah. The 3D printed artifacts in Virtual Reality Museum are amazing, but Kenyans say they're still determined to get their objects back, no matter how long it takes. These innovative ideas might be a good stopgap for now, but there's no replacement for the original. Here's the anthropologist, Juma Ondeng again.
The demands for objects is constant. It has always been there. It's not going to end. As long as those objects are there, people are more aware nowadays. And with the use of social media, the conversations within community groups about the need to return these objects is even more urgent now. So the pressure will be sustained until we see objects coming back.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Dynamite Doug. You can listen to the full episodes of Dynamite Doug on Apple Podcasts or wherever you prefer to listen. And stay tuned for our next bonus episode coming soon. It's from a symposium on Cambodia's looted art that we held recently at the Green Space in New York City. It's a fascinating discussion with legal and art crime experts and Cambodians who are fighting for the return of their statues. Today's episode was reported by Neha Wadekar, Susie Armitage edited the script, and Claire Urban edited the audio. Our story today was inspired by Jacob Kushner's reporting in National Geographic magazine about the 3D printing of historical Kenyan artifacts.